Political Capital is brought to you by Uber Canada. Learn more at uber.com/flexibilityworks.
CHEK Podcasts.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Political Capital, your source for all the latest in BC politics. I'm your host, Rob Shaw. We got a lot of topics filling our political inbox this week. A big decision on vaccine mandates for healthcare workers, TransLink threatening major service cuts without provincial bailouts, and a lot more topics that we will get into, available on video on YouTube and on CHEK, but also audio extras on our podcast feed as well. So let's bring in the pod squad. Jillian Oliver, Jeff Ferrier, Allie Blades. As usual, you are here to walk us through another week of immense BC political developments. The biggest being, first off, COVID. Man, we haven't talked about COVID in a while. Thank God. But here we are one last time talking about it because Provincial Health Officer Dr. Bonnie Henry ended the public health emergency. Most people, including myself, forgot that it was still even in place, and that meant the end to orders for mandatory vaccinations for healthcare workers, a contentious political issue that parties have been kicking around for months now, the government moving instead to a mandatory vaccine registry for healthcare workers. All sorts of debate about this, about the timing just before an election, what the parties are going to do with it, if the issue still becomes a big one. It was one of the core planks of the BC Conservative platform. Allie, how do you think this is going to shake out and where's it going to go, do you think?
Yeah, there was a time where I would comment that the BC NDP could pretty much get away with everything because they didn't really have a strong campaign running against them. And now it seems that that has changed significantly because with the Conservatives rising in popularity and being seen as an option, alternative to the NDP, now they have to actually start strategically making decisions. And I think this is one of them. And so that's because of this continued call from the Conservatives and the BC United that I think this is happening. The timing is just too suspicious. Now, I don't think this is the last we're going to hear of it, though, because I don't think that the Conservatives or BC United are going to consider this a win. It was so fundamental in their criticism of how the NDP and the government handled the pandemic, that they can't lose that anger and mobilizing some of those votes. And so it'll be, well, then how did they handle the registry or the timing of it? Why did it take so long? So I think that we're still going to hear it from the opposition, and the government will still be criticized.
Mm-hmm. And we see the opposition, the Conservatives and United, already out taking credit for this, saying we pushed the NDP into this, we pushed for this, Jillian, and trying to take a little bit of credit. I'm not sure how long you could do that with an election, 2-3 months away. But how do you think it plays?
Yeah, I think probably they've gotten all of the credit that they can already for people that really care about this issue. And, I think Allie's right. The timing is too suspicious. So close to an election. The premier was just saying, just a month ago that we can't go backwards on this. I think that they probably have been hearing it at the door as their MLAs have been getting out, especially in, some specific communities where this is a bigger issue. We've talked about this before. There wasn't strong public health justification for it. Other provinces have had the mandates for healthcare workers removed for quite some time to no bad tangible effects, and we were kind of out on our own. So I think it's the biggest point where the government is still vulnerable, I think, is just that this undermines trust in public health because it was allowed to go on for so long, apparently for political reasons. And I think when it comes to vaccines and vaccine hesitancy in general, trust is at the core of the issue. And I think that it's unfortunate, and they're vulnerable on that point. I could see the Greens making that point. I don't know if the other two will, but we'll see.
Mm-hmm. Jeff, let's bring you in. What do you think?
First of all, Rob, you got to be careful when you say the name COVID, because when you say the name COVID, it appears.
Right.
So
It's true.
let's
One
hope that we
member
don't
of the
get it.
panel currently has COVID right now, but we're not going to say who. So
Let's not get into that. I think this is about lifting vaccine mandates for healthcare workers is a tough one for government. But my sense is that it's not rooted in politics. It's rooted in public health assessments and the realities of the healthcare system. The pandemic is over. The risks of transmission and serious illness are now low. We've discussed on this show many times the need for health workers in the system is clear. And so at the recommendation of the provincial health officer, Dr. Bonnie Henry, the mandates for health workers are coming off. And it's not because of ideological or political considerations. The premier wouldn't be making statements that this is core and fundamental a month ago if this was being driven by the political side. It's being driven by the public health side, saying that the science tells us that it's the right thing to do, that we've reached a point where the value of more health workers in the system outweighs the COVID risk in our hospitals and our healthcare facilities. I expect the decision, though, as folks have mentioned, will generate fireworks that will make your local celebration of fire look like a birthday cake sprinkler. Judging from my Twitter feed, it's been a half hour. We're taping this about a half hour after the announcement, and many people will take this opportunity to suggest that the vaccine mandate was wrong or the government was wrong and the anti-vax position was right all along. I'm going to be a little bit personal in this because as longtime watchers of this show know, I worked in the Ministry of Health during COVID. To everyone here who is dunking, saying that they were victims, let's remember that the real victims in all this are British Columbians who died from COVID-19, thousands of them and their families, and folks who had surgeries pushed off, who lost years at school, who lost jobs, who saw their small businesses suffer, missed time with family and friends, missed weddings and funerals. For goodness sake, people couldn't go to funerals of people who died from COVID because it wasn't safe to get together. And when I was in the Ministry of Health, people say, Jeff, you're the NDP spin guy, and fair enough, you're entitled to your opinion, but I was there to help in a pandemic. And one thing that me and my team had to do almost every single day was report how many people had died from COVID. Every day was like a gut punch every day, seeing those numbers. Remember the day we learned that a toddler died and how difficult that was. And that was nothing compared to what those folks and their loved ones went through, and nothing compared to the strain on health workers who did get vaccinated to stop the spread and keep their patients safe. So I hope when I go on the Twitter, I don't see dunking. And I hope I see a lot of folks remembering the folks who are no longer with us, and folks thanking healthcare colleagues who did step up and held it all together for us when things were tough.
Well, if it is on Twitter, I'm sure the algorithm will push that right out of the way for the spicy hot takes from everybody else. And unfortunately, I'm expecting the reaction to this to be an undercut in the credibility of Dr. Henry, and unfortunately, because it's so close to the election. And she's been asked many times over the past months and weeks about this, and now suddenly it's changed, and I think that messaging will get embedded.
Just real quickly, what I think has changed is, and I think this is where the government is actually far more vulnerable. It's the acceleration on things like ER closures, and in a sense that the health system is straining, and that the risk of not having these health workers who can come in and help out and prevent those things, I think that is a lot of what is driving this decision from a science-based perspective, and where the government is more vulnerable than on, you should have done this sooner, or this was Kevin Falcon and John Rustad's idea, or anything like that.
Yeah. Although, Adrian Dix told me today that there's only 7 ER nurses in all of Northern Health who are affected by the vaccine mandate. So that disconnect between, the political arguments that getting rid of it will swamp our healthcare system with people who'd been fired and revitalize our ERs. I'm not sure that was ever true, but we will see what happens. And hopefully this is the last time we talk about COVID, although, man, you can make a whole montage of me.
Just said it again. You just mentioned it again.
No. Moving on to another topic this week, one I think which should have much more impact on the daily lives of British Columbians, is a report from TransLink saying as much as 50%, if not more, of bus service in Metro Vancouver could be eliminated, as well as 30% of C-bus rides, and potentially even the entire West Coast Express, and up to 30% of SkyTrain service as well, if the provincial and federal governments don't bail out the system with $600 million a year in operational funding. So that landed, and all the political parties scrambled to sort of react to it, which I think was kind of the point maybe of the report. Or maybe I'm wrong there. We can talk about that, Jillian. Again, timing, content. I mean, it's a very frightening document, and then all the political parties reacting. How did you put all that together?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can expect to see more of this in the next couple of months. It's typical in election cycles, stakeholders sort of jockeying to get commitments from parties ahead of election when the politicians' jobs are on the chopping block. But that being said, the financial situation that they're in is very real. It's not just Finn. Basically, they've been hit by cascading series of issues. The pandemic, which decreased ridership and revenue, inflationary pressures affecting all of their budgeting, and declining revenue from the fuel tax. As we electrify our transportation, they're getting less revenue as a sort of designated form that they have been getting from that tax. So it's real, and the government has been kind of coming in periodically and having these cash injections to sort of prop them up for the last couple of years. $100 million here, $50 million here, there, but it just isn't a long-term sustainable model. And I think it's funny because we've been talking about this issue for a long time. When I started working in politics in 2017, they were facing the same kind of budgetary pressures back then. The end kind of result of that conversation is always mobility pricing or congestion pricing, and no political party really wants to touch it. It's been studied a lot, and that's kind of the best policy that we kind of keep coming across. But it would be expensive, and we're in an affordability crisis. So it's going to be interesting to see what does come out of the platforms. It seems like all of the parties recognize that this is something that people really want. They all jumped on it quickly and said that something needs to be done. And it'll be interesting to see, especially what the government comes out with, because they were kind of the only ones that didn't have a longer major response this week.
Yeah, Allie, the response from the parties, if I'm sort of accurately summarizing them, the Conservatives said they do 2 years of transition funding, but they want to audit TransLink because they can't keep dumping money into it, was their position. BC United, I'm not sure, said they would pay it, but Kevin Falcon announced a big North Shore transit plan with SkyTrain to the North Shore and another bridge. So presumably we have to fund TransLink to do that. The NDP hinted, Premier David Eby hinted pretty strongly they're going to just offer this money up in their election platform and move on. And I think the Greens re-emphasized the importance of transit without quite saying that they'd fund it, but it needs to be expanded, so it's funded. So I think that's where they all landed. Does any of that jump out at you as good or bad positioning in response to this for the election?
I think the most interesting one was the response from the BC Conservatives, in fact, because I noticed a bit of a shift where I think before, again, because the Conservatives are becoming a lot more of a popular choice and seen as an alternative to the NDP now in a very serious way, that their response was a little bit more measured. It wasn't promising the stars and the moons like other political parties can easily do during an election period. Whereas I thought they were a little bit more thoughtful because, oh crap, like they could actually win this thing and then they would actually have to be responsible for it. And for that reason, the audit that they are suggesting, the taking a look at it, because what their perspective is that this is a continued problem. It continues to come up year after year, as Jillian mentioned, these cash bailouts. And it goes back to the Conservative values of we want to fix this, but in a way that is going to have some long-term benefits instead of these like very reactionary cash bailouts. And so I thought that was a very sophisticated response for the Conservatives in a way that as the election ramps up, we might see more of. And then on the other side of the center right, as you noted, the BC United announced a comprehensive North Shore plan, and I thought that was shocking to me, that it was North Shore specific, as to, in comparison to the Conservatives, where they focused more so on Surrey, which has like a larger population, has ton more demand in transit service needs right now. And so I think that's a little bit indicative as to where these parties are going to be spending their time as well.
Mm-hmm. Maybe the United plans on doing specific community transportation plan announcements, as numerous ways. I don't know, but you're right. It was very focused on North Vancouver. Jeff, I've been covering politics since 2008, and I've lost track of how many times TransLink has said they're about on the verge of disaster. They want carbon tax money. They wanted per vehicle subsidies. They wanted parking fees. They wanted road pricing. On and on and on. Governments have sort of successively faced this financial disaster looming for TransLink. So I guess I'm not surprised by the report, but the contents of it were just electoral kryptonite for anyone who doesn't want to give TransLink the money. If you're going to lose entire transit service to a whole handful of communities in the report, that doesn't go very far.
Yeah, it's true. Quickly on Kevin Falcon and the North Shore, and I know why he's doing rapid transit in the North Shore, because he's soon to be transiting rapidly out of his job and into the private sector. So it's top of mind. And I thought the Conservatives' response was more high level. And I think that's because they went to their usual source for policy help, which is a deep dive into Twitter, and couldn't find any sensible transit policy there that they could co-opt. So I think maybe that's where they landed. This is a big deal. Without provincial help, you'll see service cuts that will hurt riders in the lower mainland. I think the government has done a reasonably good job on transit, funding big projects like Broadway Subway and Surrey Langley SkyTrain, and in the last 2 years, they've injected $800 million into operational funding to prevent cuts. But the fundamental problem with TransLink is that the funding model seems to be based on the novel funding mechanisms of the government in power. And there's no long-term sustainable model for giving the money for the transportation system that we need. And it's not a transit issue, right? It's an issue of our economy fundamentally. How do we keep people moving? How do we keep goods moving? How do we maintain a high quality of life? How do we build the housing and welcome the people we need without a stable transit? You can't have high density housing along transit lines without operating transit lines. So I think the mayors are warning us now, so voters and parties get what's at stake in the next election. And I think looking at the numbers, we don't have much time to fix this, and the problem is big. So the next government needs to have a serious plan from day one. And if you want to look at a jurisdiction with a serious plan, Doug Ford in Ontario is investing $60 billion in transit over 10 years. He's not talking about waste. He's not talking about administration. He's saying we need transit to keep the economy moving and keep our cities growing. And I think all the parties in this campaign should commit the same.
The devil's advocate position on this, because it's come up over the years, is that other communities have to invest their own money often in transit, and that Vancouver, got an exemption on having to put in money for healthcare in order to continue to fund transit with property taxes. That was always the agreement in Metro Vancouver. And, the previous Liberal government resisted the idea that the province has to come in and bail TransLink out all the time, that local taxpayers in Metro Vancouver have to foot that bill. And we sort of have drifted over time to this idea that the province is going to end up massively subsidizing in perpetuity TransLink without an alternative funding model, because they're stuck in that BC Ferries position of you can't allow them to charge what it actually costs to run the system for a ticket. You artificially put your thumb on the scale to keep the tickets price low, and then you ask them to fund it, and the only person who can come in and save it is the province. So I
I
don't
knew
know.
you were going to say this, Rob, and I have facts.
Oh no! Well,
let's
let's cut his feed. All right.
No,
okay.
The province provides a subsidy of 30% for operating costs of transit in BC transit communities, and the subsidy in Metro Vancouver is no. Metro Vancouver pay 18.5 cents per liter for transit in Metro Vancouver. The rest of the province, it's 11 or 6. There's a hydro levy and DCCs for transit in the Lower Mainland. The rest of the province has none of that. The proportion of property tax bill going to transit in Metro Vancouver is at least 30% higher than anywhere else.
But that wasn't that the arrangement, right? Because in another community, you have to kick in money to help build a hospital. But in Vancouver, the province foots it entirely in order to the property
Metro
tax.
Vancouver residents pay more for their transit than anywhere else, as it should be. But we need some sustainable solutions for transit. We can get circling on the numbers and have people like me be Poindexters and read out Excel spreadsheets. But at some point, government's got to prioritize the economic health of the region and say, if we're going to have a working Lower Mainland, we need to have a working public transit and transportation system.
Yeah. Allie, what about the idea, like, does this feed into the conservative argument that we can't keep throwing money at problems? Like, they have this underlining point in healthcare and others that the government is running a massive deficit, bigger spending than ever, and yet life isn't really that much better. It seems like they're expanding that a little bit to transit as well.
That's exactly it. And I think we're going to continue to see kind of that narrative of they want to truly go in and fix it for the long term versus throwing money at it or have these quick short-term solutions to it. You know, we talk a lot about the provincial funding, but there was a small piece in here about federal influx of cash into this too, where in previous shows we talk about the relationship between Victoria and Ottawa and the disconnect. And this was one of those disconnects where the federal government is offering a ton of money for transit, but focused on new lines near like high density infrastructure, but that's not the problem that we have right now. We have a more deep rooted issue in we can't afford what we have, let alone let's talk about these other big projects that are potentially at stake. And one of those that I think that the NDP will try really hard to preserve is the line to Langley in all of this, where it was one of their big campaign promises in 2020. And they're certainly on track to deliver it. Who knows when, but they're on track to deliver it. And if they can't, that makes them look bad too.
All right, we'll leave it there. Thanks to the panel for being here and breaking everything down this week. And thank you for watching. We'll be back a couple weeks off, but before you know it, we will be back with all the latest in BC politics here on Political Capital. Political Capital is brought to you by Uber Canada. Learn more at uber.com/flexibilityworks.